Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some political fantasy book recommendations. I have a lot of different books to mention because I think that when you talk about political fantasy, that can mean so many different things. It can mean political intrigue, the scheming, the manipulation. It could mean the forms of government and different kinds of government systems, how they work, the pros, the cons. It could mean military political fantasy. So I wanted to try to find books that fit within all of those different categories. I'm going to start with one that is about the day-to-day, literal hour by hour decision making of somebody in power, and that would be the Goblin Emperor. The setup is that we follow a young man named Maya who was never intended to rule or be the emperor. However, there was something that occurred that killed everyone in line before him, and now he is thrust into this position of power, and he is scrambling. He is doing his best. He has a lot of trauma associated with his youth, as well as how he was treated by his father, who was the emperor, and his mother, who has passed away. And so you're exploring a lot of Maya and everything he has gone through and how what he has gone through has shaped him. But on top of that, how those things have shaped him then play a role in how he governs. And so I really loved seeing how he makes the decisions he makes, his thought process behind them, and also the weight that that put on his shoulders and how stressful it can be to make these tiny decisions and these massive decisions. But he does everything with so much care. He genuinely tries so hard to do what he thinks is right, and how what is right is not always going to please other people in power. You don't always get the luxury of doing whatever you want. You have to appease the other people who are essentially your advisors, people that also could become political adversaries to you. You have to take those people into consideration, but sometimes what those people want isn't what's best for the general population or even individuals involved in foreign affairs. So there's just so much to take in, and you follow Maya as he makes, like I said, decision to the next decision to the next decision, and I loved it. I think some people will find this dry. I think some people will find this really boring, but I absolutely loved getting to dissect what genuinely felt like a real person in power. On top of all of that, something that I liked as far as a world building detail and attention to detail that other people might not like is just how many names you get, all the history, all of the things involved with this family and this line of people, and how this person doesn't really get along with this person, why this advisor wants this. There's just so much to this fantasy world. It is very fantasy heavy in the names, how they're pronounced, how they're spelled. There's just a lot to attempt to keep track of. What I will say is it's more about, I think, creating a realistic setting and a realistic atmosphere so that it feels genuinely real. It feels like a lived-in world. But I don't think that you have to be taking a ton of notes to know who's who. There's some players that are more significant than others, and that's kind of up for you to decide. And what I think I liked about it is it then extended that feeling of this being real, because if you were actually Maya and you were thrust into this position, you wouldn't know who is who. You would interact with this person, then you'd interact with this person, you'd try to keep track of something. But some people are a little less significant than others, and so you have to determine that. So it feels like you're determining that alongside Maya. But I think some people are just going to be like, where's the action? And when is something interesting going to happen? But I loved it. I loved Maya as a main character. I loved following all these tiny things in his day. So I really like this. I think it's kind of peak political fantasy. Next up, we have a couple that are military fantasy that I think bleed into political fantasy inevitably, because it is generally the people involved in power and politics that are also involved in the decision-making of war. And so the two recommendations here would be She Who Became the Sun, as well as Grace of Kings. Both of these are essentially reimaginings of events in history. So if you are somebody who is really into history, then you are going to see so much in these books that you likely have a lot of knowledge of. And then you can see the ways in which the authors have taken the fantastical elements and put them in, so it kind of feels like that's genuinely what happened at that time within those battles. She Who Became the Sun is one of those books that it almost could just be sold as historical fiction, because when the fantasy elements do come into play, you kind of almost are like, is this actually happening? Or is this like the character believes it's happening, so they see it that way, but it's not actually happening. It's one of those sorts of stories. And it's not really very heavy on the fantasy aspects, but the reason that I'm mentioning it for political is because you see the ways in which people in power make decisions that then affect, like I was saying before, battles. It affects war. And it shows you these different pieces on the board and how all these individuals who are trying to gain power end up butting heads with each other. There are two perspectives in particular. One that you start with, that you're following for a while, who at first you're kind of rooting for, but the further into the story you get, the more you realize how much power and politics corrupts and what a person has to do to actually attain power. So you see that individual butting heads with another person who has been mistreated by people in power, but is now in a position where they have the ability to dictate certain events. They are very strong when it comes to combat, and when you see these two forces go against each other, there's this interesting amount of respect given, and it very much feels tension filled. You're kind of waiting for this inevitable moment of them coming together. You could say so many similar things to The Grace of Kings. This one, I think, almost felt like if you were to take a textbook excerpt about a certain battle or a series of battles or a war, and then you were diving into that and you were actually exploring it in a way that has more of a narrative, and that you're actually getting to know the characters as opposed to just seeing their names within a textbook. And so it did feel like I was reading real history with the occasional god mentioned or the occasional other fantastical element put in. I do think this has a little more fantasy elements to it than She Who Became the Sun. It's also quite thick, so there's a lot more to it, and I think that because this one goes over a very large amount of time, it almost feels like a trilogy of books in one. But once again, you're looking at how power corrupts. You're looking at how people who start out as everyday people who then want something more, how cutthroat they can become, how barbaric they can become, how they can turn their back on people that they previously had alliances with. And so I think both of these not only explore the political military aspects, but they also are looking at very morally gray characters. If you're looking for more of court politics, the little decisions that people make or the little things people say and the I said one thing, but I actually mean another kind of political fantasy, the intrigue aspect, I think that Castles in Their Bones and Warbreaker are definitely going to fit the bill for that. Castles in Their Bones is young adult. We follow these three sisters. They are triplets who, from the time they were born, their mother has been training them how to manipulate the various different kingdoms they're going to be married into. She teaches them about the cultures of these three different places. She teaches them about the people they're going to be married to, what they like, their interests, and how to break them apart, break them down, and conquer all of them for herself. And the daughters are going their various different ways. One is very devoted to her mother's plan. One is very sweet, and she's somewhat devoted, but she also is perhaps being a little bit swayed by the place she's being married into. The other one has always been stubborn, but she also has a very deep love for her sisters, and so she's trying to find that balance of doing what her mother wants, helping her sisters, but at the same time, she's has this urge to kind of resist and rebel. And you're seeing the way that these sisters have obstacles that they have to face, some of which they were expecting, some of which they were not expecting whatsoever. Each of their situations is very different from the other. And so in this first book, you are kind of kept on your toes. You're getting to know who's who and what's what alongside them. And I think it makes for a very interesting reading experience where you always kind of want to flip the page because there's always something happening somewhere. And then there's some twists that you don't really expect. And there is a sequel that's out currently. The sequel is much more about the character development and whose side that they're really on. So I think the second one slows down quite a bit, but regardless, this is definitely the kind of I'm going to say one thing in hopes that it makes this other person say something, and then I can find out if this person's on my side or if they're actually an enemy or those sorts of things. So the little things. And then Warbreaker, we follow two sisters, one who has been groomed her whole life to fulfill this marriage alliance. The other is somebody who has no political obligations and therefore knows nothing really when it comes to this other kingdom her sister is going to be married into. However, there is a almost parent trap situation that occurs where the father just cannot send his beloved daughter to this kingdom. So he sends the clueless one, and so she doesn't know what the heck is going on, and she's trying to figure out what to do and how to not die and how to not accidentally do something that would then lead this kingdom to go to war with hers. And then her sister's like, oh no, my sister's clueless. I must go rescue her. So she goes on this rescue mission, but she doesn't know what she's doing. She doesn't know how to live among people and disguise herself. They're both clueless. And there is a lot to do with the inner workings of this kingdom and how the court type of politics, how sneaky people can be, and what is this person's motivation. And if you find out their motivation, then you're like, well, what's their end goal here? And you have one character who is from this other place, who is essentially somebody who was born into godhood after dying as a human, and he doesn't really remember his life as a human, but people believe he is divine, and he doesn't believe in his own divinity. So you do get some really cool fantasy elements, and one of my favorite Sanderson magic systems. Speaking of Sanderson, next up we have the Way of Kings. For whatever reason, Way of Kings does not come to mind when I think political fantasy, and I don't know how many other people have that as well, but it fits very perfectly into a number of different kinds of political fantasy. For one, we have a character that is literally involved in the politics, Dalinar Kholin. He is a high prince, and he is somebody who serves the king, whose name is Elliot, and you see the way in which he's trying to unite these various other high princes together. You get to see their form of government, and again, you actually do get to see a lot of scheming. You see a lot of scheming involved with other high princes, the way that they are competitive with one another, how that plays a role within their culture, or how it's impacted by their culture, and you see that they are in some ways allies. They all serve the king, but they also all serve themselves. And then on top of that, you see how the actions of these individuals trickle down into the very bottom of society, and you see that with the character of Kaladin. Kaladin is a bridgeman, who are people who have to run in front of the armies carrying bridges. They are slaves. They're not given any kind of protection, shields or armor or anything like that when they run these bridges out in front of the armies, and it is pretty much a death sentence to be a bridgeman. Some of the high princes use bridgemen, others do not. Others think it is barbaric, that it is a terrible thing to force any human being to do. However, you see the way in which, by having honor, like Dalinar does, because he doesn't use bridgemen, that means that they do not gain as much riches as other individuals like the High Prince Sadeas, who gains so much more because he takes advantage of this barbaric system. And again, you see the way that this little decision, it affects what they gain, but it also has such a terrible impact on people's lives, and the way in which everything comes together with the politics, how everything plays out at the end, the military aspects of the story, it really does fit into so many elements of political fantasy. After that, we have a fantasy political romance, and that would be The Bridge Kingdom. This is a story that follows a woman who has a marriage alliance. You see a lot of those in political fantasy. She has a marriage alliance to somebody from a kingdom where it's meant to have their kingdoms join. However, it's very clear to the man that she is marrying, named Arryn, that she is likely going to try and gain information from him so that she can report it back to her father, and her father can use that against them. And so it is very much an enemies to lovers, even though they are meant to be married to one another. One of them is looking to bring the other down. She indeed is trying to find information to report back to her father. However, the more she gets to know Arryn, the more that she is recognizing that maybe her own kingdom is actually at fault for a lot of the hardships that people are facing, both in the kingdom she's marrying into, the Bridge Kingdom, as well as her own. And then Arryn, as he's getting to know Lara, he is trying to determine whether or not he should trust her. A lot of his instincts, while you as the reader know were right, he is starting to see that Lara seems to care very much about his people, and as she cares about his people, he starts to wonder, well, this seems to go against what I expected of her, and maybe she is to be trusted. And so you're getting all this, as well as some other political rivals who are interested in the Bridge Kingdom, because it has thus far essentially not been conquerable, but it does play a role in the economy of various different kingdoms. So it is something a lot of people in power seek. And the tension and the relationship between the characters is one that I quite enjoyed as well. So if you're looking for political fantasy with some romance, you might want to check out The Bridge Kingdom. Last for today, we have political fantasy that involves forms of government and changes within society. And that would be, of course, the Aurelian Cycle, starting with Fireborne by Rosaria Munda, who I think is a master at it. And then we also have Engines of Empire. Fireborne follows a few main perspectives. In the first book, we have Annie and Lee. They were very young when there was a revolution, but this revolution played a huge impact on their society, in their lives personally, and it kind of thrust them into poverty. They met each other as orphans, and now this new form of government tells everybody that you are able to make anything of yourself. It is not determined by your birth, it is determined by what you put into the system, and everybody is going to be treated exactly the same. However, there's so much commentary on how people from the previous regime, who were upper class, who had more to start with, already have an advantage and kind of one foot across the line. They're already going to have a leg up on everybody else because they have the knowledge from tutors and better education when they were young, that they're going to test better now. And then you also see what happens when there's actually some kind of threat, when there is a shortage of food, when you have outside people coming to try and conquer them. You're seeing the way that maybe not everybody is treated equal after all, and you're seeing the flaws in this new form of government. You also have dragons. This is essentially historical fiction with dragons mixed in, and the individuals who have dragons, which are the kinds of people that Annie and Lee are, they're the individuals who are supposed to protect society. What happens when those people have essentially this weapon that they can use however they please? There isn't really the checks and balances needed, and the way that you would need to rein someone in who has that much power. Can anyone ever truly be equal when somebody has something so strong at their disposal? And so there's so many questions asked in this first book, and I think it's asked very well. And in the second book, you see the way in which the other kingdoms are impacted by governments that haven't been toppled yet, and how they look at what's going on in this one. You also see kind of freedom of press, freedom of speech. That's also a big thing that's discussed in that second book, and then everything comes together in that third one. It is a completed series, so if you're wanting to check it out, I can't recommend it enough. I absolutely love that trilogy. I think it's one of the best for political fantasy. And then with Engines of Empire, this is one that's much more about how people who have the desire to make money play a role in politics. So how economy and politics come together. Our main perspectives are all part of something called the Hawkspur Guild. The Hawkspur Guild is kind of leading the way when it comes to advancements in technology. So you do see technology butting heads with religion and magic, and how magic is kind of being left behind for technology, or sometimes how magic is being used for technology, and also how they turn a blind eye to where they get some of their materials for their advancement in technology. The way they go other places and decide, all of you are less than us, all of you are not as advanced as us, so we're going to take what we need from you, and then we're just going to kind of make more money. And you see how that plays a role in the politics, how the matriarch of the Hawkspur Guild is trying to balance out her guild while also influencing what's going on in the government, and how she has to then interact with other people who are wanting to make money for themselves, and how they have different trade deals. She's trying to negotiate certain things. Her children, who are all adults and are other perspectives as well, are in different places on the map. You see one of them involved in the military, one of them who's getting to know more about the magic, and one of them who's getting to know more about a different group of people in a place where her family has been seeking things from. So I think it really shows so many different sides to how the economy and the technology is impacted or is impacting the politics. So it's not maybe political in the same way that something like Fireborne is. It's not really going to be as subtle and sneaky as some of the court politic type of political fantasy books are. But I think it's a little bit of a mix of so many of the different kinds of political fantasy. As a little honorable mention, my book, Peace and Turmoil, is absolutely 100% political fantasy, and I typically don't mention my book, but it is political fantasy if you are interested in that genre, that subgenre of fantasy. And also a lot of you always very sweetly tell me, like, you should talk about your book more often. And so this is really the perfect recommendations video to mention it in. We follow a group of various different heirs to their kingdoms and how they are all personally trying to do what's best for themselves, best for their kingdoms, but sometimes those two things are at odds, and then oftentimes what is best for one kingdom is not what's best for another. And so you have all these different individuals who aren't necessarily bad, they're not necessarily good, they're just people trying to do what they think is best, but sometimes what they think is best leads them to become enemies with other individuals or can lead to certain things that might result in war. Let me know if you have any of your own political fantasy recommendations. I would absolutely love to know because it is one of my favorite things about fantasy. It's definitely a buzzword. If I hear something is political fantasy, I am instantly intrigued. So please let me know what your recommendations are. If you're interested in any of these books, I'll have them all linked in the description bar down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.